everyone, I'm Ari here with Rachel, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. This week we're on episode 263, and we're asking, who is Amanda Blake? Before we start, if you enjoy the show, please do consider checking out our coffee page. You can follow the page for free, as we have plenty of freebies for all. And if you're feeling generous, you can become a Merry Writer for $2 a month. You'll help keep the show going and also have access to bonus episodes and exclusive shop items. If that's not your style and you still enjoy the podcast, then please subscribe wherever you're listening if you haven't already.
But enough about us. Please help us welcome Amanda Blake to the show. Amanda, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and share a little bit about your writing background?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I've been writing horror and fantasy for pretty much 20 years this summer. On the horror side, I write everything from quiet to gothic to extreme. So from no blood to all the blood in the world. And in fantasy, I specialize in fairy tale reimaginings. And it kind of bleeds into horror as well, because of course fairy tales are horrifying. I write everything from flash fiction and poetry to series of novels, and I like everything in between. So I keep myself interested.
Yeah, we were looking at your website when you filled out the form to be on the podcast, and gotta say, I'm really impressed with like your wide variety of stories, because you really go all over the map.
Yeah, I'm easily bored. So, and there's just a lot of room to play in within fantasy and horror, and you can go extremely realistic, you can go completely out there, cosmic, or sword and sorcery. So there's just a lot of room there.
I like that. I have to say, at first when I saw horror and fantasy, I thought it was like horror fantasy. I was like, oh, but like horror and fantasy, which are quite separate, but also probably, I said, blended a bit together.
Yeah, I am at heart a horror writer, but even when I'm writing fantasy, there's a little bit of a heart of darkness there. So, and then when I go over to horror, you kind of see the wonder of fantasy. So I think fantasy is kind of the wonder, horror is fear, and they kind of blend really well.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. I think most people I know who write horror, they seem to write horror or thriller. The idea of horror and fantasy is really cool. I mean, that's literally my partner loves horror. I love fantasy. It's like it's a perfect match. We're swapping books and everything. So perfect for that.
I am not a big horror person. I gotta throw that out there. It's too spooky for me. I like ghosts, but like horror, no.
I mean, ghosts are horror. The thing about horror is that it's kind of a piggyback genre, so it piggybacks on a lot of different genres. So ghosts are kind of in the realm of fantasy, paranormal, and then you can add the jump scares, but a lot of ghost stories are really about grief. And grief is such a different state of emotion for us. It's even like a different state of mind. Our brain becomes different in grief, that it feels like a kind of horror because it's a different perspective of reality. So that's what I love about ghost stories. It is horror, but it's often a very quiet horror and sad.
That's an interesting way of looking at it, because that's what I write. I write paranormal that focuses on the grief and the like raw emotions that come with it. But I never really thought of it in that sense because, yeah, I guess I don't do jump scares, but I guess in a way, yeah, it is like a horror for some people.
Can I ask, can you do jump scares in a book?
I've never had a jump scare in a like I've never reacted in a jump scare way to books. I mean, I know some people have. Like there's a scene in Max Booth's We Need to Do Something that people describe as a jump scare. And there's a single line in a chapter in Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door that could be perceived as kind of like a punch, an emotional punch that is almost like a jump scare in literary form. But it does function very differently in writing than it does in visuals, because of course in visuals you have in movies you have what you can see, and then you have the violin sting that jolts you in a different sensory way, whereas in writing it's very much in a reader's control in a way that it isn't in a movie or a TV script. But I guess there are some. I just don't tend to react to horror in the same way when I'm reading it versus watching it.
Yeah, you bring up some good points. I think the movies, like you do, you have the visual and you also have the sound effects. But I will say, I read Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney a summer or two ago, whenever it was, and I was home alone. I was pet sitting, and while reading that, every creak and noise that happened in the house, I assumed something from the book was coming to get me. So I guess in a weird way, that could kind of count as a jump scare.
It is funny how like I can read the most terrifying things and not really get scared, but I read Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, and in the first in kind of I think it's the prologue, there was something about it that just made me afraid that a compy was going to come down my hallway and get me. It was just so masterfully written that that's one of the few times I've really been scared when I read.
It is weird. I appreciate we should be getting into the questions, but I'm going to add my little thing. I remember the one thing I read was I want to say James Herbert, Rats. Now, I have no fear of rats. I love rats. They are the cutest. I have no issue with rats. But I read his book, Rats, in the daylight, bright sunny day, sat on the bed. And in the book, it was like intense. And then I got up and knocked a coat hanger and it brushed against my leg. And I screamed the house down, jumped on the bed and freaked out that this rat was going to kill me. And again, no issue with rats. Still don't have an issue with rats. And the fact that he got in my head on a sunny day was just crazy. That's how good the writing was.
I was reading Paul Zendel's Rats. It was probably inspired by that. It was middle grade rather than adult, and I got so nervous that a rat was going to crawl up the toilet when I was sitting on it. So I was just like lying there in bed in fear. I needed to go to the bathroom, but I was afraid a rat was going to come out after me. Yeah, that basically anything in a toilet's kind of scary to me.
It's not of all the things, that's the one thing you don't want to have to worry about. Like it's a necessity. So okay, let's get to some questions. Did you get a lot of support when you told people that you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, I would say that I got a lot of support. And in fact, it was support that ultimately made me want to be a writer. When I was in second grade, I was just, making stuff up for an assignment. And my second grade teacher says, "Hey, I want to enter this into contest." And it was like a light went on in my head. I was like, "Oh, wait, I'm good at this." And then I proceeded to become really, really annoying with any, writing assignment. I just got really, really into it because it's like, she gave me encouragement and suddenly I wanted to really try my best at accomplishing a good story. And of course at that age, at 6 years old, I was not capable of writing a great story, but I look back at that writing and I was already starting to use longer words and metaphor and simile in a way that I hadn't been taught. It was stuff that I had read or that my parents used to read to me, so they had read stuff to me. So I had already had that sort of foundation of reading fiction or hearing it read to me and a very vivid imagination. So from there, I started writing. And it wasn't until about 17 that I really started writing with the aim to publish. I am the only one in my family who does any kind of creative thing with this amount of obsession. So they don't understand me, but they respect that it's important and that I consider it work and that it's very valuable to me. So when I'm just sitting there looking at a computer, they don't see a lazy layabout. They see someone who's working. That's even better than having parents who understand me and who did those sort of things and do those sort of things. They don't understand it and yet they support me and I really appreciate that from them.
Oh, that's really great. I like the fact that it was like a teacher kind of sparked it. Obviously, you were already interested in writing in some form, and they kind of sparked the idea of, well, you could do something good with this.
They put the parasite in my head. Yes. It has been running me ever since.
The brain worm is in there. Like, here's all the ideas and that. But it's so interesting, like the fact that you're the only one with this creativity in that way, this creative pursuit. And yet it's like, because you often, that's where you get people going like, come on, you don't need that, do something else. But the fact that you are given that support is absolutely incredible.
My brother also writes. He does it's kind of gone a bit by the wayside since he's had kids, but he writes media reviews. So he loves cinema and stuff like that. And he's kind of interested in starting eventually once the kids grow up a little bit more and he has more time. But it's always been more of a hobby for him, whereas I kind of step along the edge of hypergraphia of I absolutely need to write today. There must be something written today. I must get into the business of writing.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, having it as a hobby is obviously wonderful as well. And I know you said that your family, like, they don't necessarily understand it to your level, but the fact that they see you typing on your computer and see you working and they say, "Oh, Amanda's working," that in a way is its own type of understanding. So it's not the same level, but it's still pretty nice.
Yeah, every time I write a book and I publish it, my mom asks, "Is this one I can read?" And more often than not, I have to say no. This is not something you can read, Mom. You won't want to read it. You won't like it.
That's a whole nother conversation. It's like, do you want your friends and family to
Yeah,
read what
like
you
I'm
write?
fine with perfect strangers, but then, someone I know says, "Oh, I picked up your book," and I'm like, "Oh no. Oh no."
At
Okay.
least she asks. At least she
Yeah.
asks first rather than going, I've read your book. And you're like, oh no.
Well, she doesn't like gore or unlikable characters, and of course I do both of those things. So I know that most of what I do does not appeal to her at all.
Which is fair. And it's nice that you recognize that. And as Ari said, it is nice that she asks. But even there's also just like this weird thing. It's like, yeah, when a stranger reads your work, it's like, whatever. If they like it, they like it. If they don't, oh well. But if a family member or a close friend reads it, you're like, oh, don't think I'm weird. Don't think I'm weird. But so you write like a whole wide variety. So what exactly does your writing process look like?
So for the longest time, my process was incredibly boring. I would come up with an idea, I would sit down, I would write it from start to finish. I don't jump around. I didn't really do a lot of notes. I didn't have a wonderful, murder board or post-its. One of the writers I knew had like a whole binder of all of her research and it was all color coded. And I've never been able to do anything particularly interesting. It's just sit in front of a computer and write, which, as I said, it looks like lazy layabout, even though it's working. But kind of recently, within the last few years, I don't know whether it's getting older, whether it's perimenopause messing with my head, whether it's I've had COVID at least once, probably twice. I don't know whether that's affected my brain or whether there's something else going on. But I've had a little bit more problems just within the last few years in my latter 30s, where it felt like for my long form fiction, I was juggling a lot and I was having trouble keeping a hold on all the different threads happening. If there's one thing happening in the story, it's a lot easier to keep track of. But if there's multiples, I started having trouble knowing where each thread was going and where it was supposed to go. So, like just this earlier this year, I started a novel. I wrote 35,000 words before I realized it was not working. I was learning about the characters and eventually realized that all of my conflict was external, no internal, and it needed more internal or it needed more external. So I changed the perspective. 2 weeks later, I started again, another 25,000 words. Again, I hit a point in the novel where there was no story. There was nothing that was going to happen. It was all concept and no plot because the characters wouldn't do what I wanted them to do. So I sulked and seethed for about 2 more weeks, found another story that I had discarded, put what I liked about the first story into that story, and proceeded to outline just to make sure that this time, yes, absolutely, you have a line of plot going through it. And that really was ultimately what made it work for me because I knew every beat of the story. And I had always been able to have that in my head, but it was a lot easier when it was no longer there, when I had it external and I no longer had to hold on to everything. So in the past, I didn't outline because it would feel like I had already told the story and then I would lose the momentum for actually telling it. But now when I outline it, I forget almost everything that I've written in the outline because I don't need to be holding the memory. So of course I let it go. And now when I'm looking at each point in the outline, it reminds me of something that I'd forgotten. So it really isn't like I've already written it. It's a surprise. Each scene that I go to, when I finish a scene, I look at the next scene, I'm like, oh, I forgot about that. So it really is like a rediscovery rather than a rehash. So the lesson there is know your process, but don't get too bogged down in that process. Don't get too superstitious about your process. You may need to change it at a different point in your life. Your brain is different than when you were in your teens and your 20s. You may be more stressed, you may be burnt out, you may need to change how you do things in order to do things effectively.
That's such an important lesson for everybody to know and learn during their writing career, because it's true, as we get older, we learn more and we change and we adapt, and therefore our writing has to adapt as well. And we know more just about like the writing process and the craft of writing and stuff too. So what you wrote way back when and the way you wrote it is going to be vastly different how you would do it now. But even then, if you're working on two different projects, especially if they're two different genres, one process, the way you write one book is going to have a different process for the other one. So you got to learn to be open to change, as you said, and just figure things out as you go along. And it's not easy, but it's just one of the many perks of being a writer. But I have to say, I really appreciate that you didn't delete anything from those 35,000 words and the 25,000 words. You found a way that you were able to repurpose it and revisit it, even though it wasn't how you initially thought it would go, but you were still able to use it at some point. And I like that. That's very good.
Yeah, I never delete anything. I never know when I'm going to need something. I have actually never gone back to anything that I've, put into my trunk as a discard, but it's comforting to know it's there if I ever need it. And the whole outline process, it's not like a constant, I don't need to do it for every long project. Several of the horror projects that I've done in the last 2 years were very much a start from the beginning, go to the end. I have no clue what's happening. And that was actually half the fun. And what let me do that was that there was a single through line. It was all in one place. There was no, like, they didn't have to go to different settings. It was all very contained. So I got to kind of move through, in the case of the book Question Not My Salt, which came out in February, it all took place during a Thanksgiving dinner. So I got to kind of move through courses, and it was all very contained and therefore within my control. And in a book that I wrote called In the Dollhouse We All Wait, it all took place in a giant mansion. And I knew where everything was in the mansion, so I could just kind of travel through that. And again, it was very much in my control. Whereas, for instance, the book that I was having so much trouble with, there were several different places I need to go. There were several different perspectives I needed to keep track of. So the more complicated the book becomes, the more likely I would need the outline. But I also really enjoyed not knowing where it was going and figuring out where it was headed, kind of as the reader would be, because it was almost like wandering through a labyrinth maze or the woods, knowing that there was an end, not like Blair Witch Project wandering through the woods.
I have to say that is all brilliant, but I did like have heart stutters when you said you don't have notes and you don't use post-its, and it's like, what? You don't use post-its? You don't have a binder full of stuff? What is this? And it just hurt me. It just hurt me on a personal level. I have to say, it did.
Well, I mean, I do have post-its and I do have notebooks, but that's more to just put down a thought before it leaves me. Like when you're in the shower or you're about to go to bed, you're like, and you have a thought. You have a thought. It's such a good thought. And you tell yourself, you're going to remember it. You're never going to remember it. Write it down. Have a notebook. Have a post-it. But no, I don't have sort of an orderly post-it board, and all of my notes don't, they're just thoughts written down. There's no order there. But yes, always write it down. You will remember. You will forget, rather.
I have Aqua Notes in my shower.
Oh, I need that.
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's relatively cheap and it works really well. Yeah, you should definitely get it. Because my main problem with it is when I get out of the shower, I forget to take the paper And then like later on, a few showers later, I'm looking at the notepad. I'm like, oh yeah, I wrote that down.
That only works if you make good notes. I have to admit, I am a bad person for certain notes because I'll be like, oh, I had this idea. I'll put 3 words. It'll trigger what the actual thought was. And it's like, no, it won't. It's like when I write a phone number down and then 3 days later, I'm like, whose phone number was that? You know? And it's like the number of post-its I've had with random phone numbers or weird reference numbers. And then 3 weeks later, I'm like, I think that was important, but I don't know what it's for because I didn't put it down. So yeah, if you're going to make notes, make better notes than what I do. Just have to say that. It's my question though, isn't it? All right. Talking about all the different things you do, what is your favorite to write? You know, you've got your novels, novellas, short stories, standalone series. Have you got a favorite?
So I've pretty much been writing long form since I was about 10. I started trying to write a novel around that time. You know, you want to be the child prodigy. I was not the child prodigy, but I always had a mind for novels because my brain is very cinematic. So I would kind of pull back, zoom back, and I would see a lot more, and my ideas just kind of would grow organically and spread like a tree, and I would just it was really meant for novel length stories. So for the longest time I thought that was all I could really do, and when I started writing seriously at 17, that's what I did. It was really only when I hit fan fiction that I started at least experimenting in short form, because it was a lot easier in fan fiction to play within smaller slices of that world, because people reading it would already know what that world was. You didn't have to concern yourself with world building. You could focus on a scene or a series of scenes or a concept, an idea, and you didn't have to flesh anything out. That was where I started exercising that particular skill. But it wasn't really until 2021 that I decided, hey, let me try short stories. I started seeing submission calls from markets that sounded really interesting, and my brain started lighting up in new ways. While I was used to kind of writing, if you watch Great British Baking Show, my writing was always the showstopper, the big thing that had all the bells and whistles and three-dimensional and various textures, and all of that was a lot of fun. But then I started to want to just have a slice of that cake rather than the entire cake. And that's a good way to look at short fiction. It's really more of a slice. You know the entire world that it takes place in, but you take one isolated point in that world and you take it out. I really, really like short fiction that's about 5,000 words to 10,000 words. It's a kind of short fiction that's both efficient and has room to breathe a bit, to kind of give you a more in-depth glimpse into a world. But there's something just really amazing about writing flash fiction, which I do that a lot for Crystal Lake, because they have a flash fiction contest every month called Shallow Waters, and they give you a theme and you write on the theme. And I just really enjoy doing that because it is such a punch of emotion, of mind visual color. And it's really a skill. It is a skill that is very different from long short fiction, from novellas, from novels, from series. It's the ability to condense everything into the moment. And I'm really just kind of intrigued by that, because in long short fiction, you will have a beginning, a middle, and an end in a way that you don't in flash fiction. In flash fiction, you kind of start near the end in a way that includes the beginning and the middle, but it's not necessary to include it. If I don't know whether that makes any sense, but it is really becoming very efficient with your storytelling and what you absolutely need to have that emotional punch.
That's really cool. I have to say, when you said at the beginning about how you write long, you start with mainly long form, and that was where you were, and how you had this kind of cinematic view. It's like, wow, that is exactly how I am. It's this whole like, you pull back, you see the whole thing, and that's why I have always struggled to condense down into small form because it's like, no, every time I'm like, yeah, I'm going to write a short book, and even like, oh, I'm going to write a 70,000 word story, and it's like, oh, look, we're on 120,000 again. Great. I just don't know how. I mean, I've managed it, but it's like blood out of a stone for me. But I can understand why it is something that people like lean into.
The funny thing that, and it's kind of been an ongoing joke with a friend and me, is that my Thorns series started out as a short story. I wrote the short story, realized it needed to be a novel. I started to write the novel, realized that it wanted to be a trilogy. I started to write the trilogy, realized it was going to be a series. And I was like, oh, here we go again. And then last year I wrote a lot of short fiction. This year I'm working on long fiction, and I'm realizing that a lot of these sub calls for anthologies and stuff like that, I'm getting ideas for long fiction. It's like I don't want to narrow it into that little space. Suddenly I'm starting to expand the ideas again. So I probably go through stages.
No, that's fair. Because I think short stories and flash fiction is like the highest form, or almost the highest form of practice you can do for writing, because you really need to condense it. And it's not even just necessarily about like, you still have to have the character development, the world building, you still have to develop the plot, you still have to have some form of a beginning, middle, and end. And I really appreciate it, because I started off writing novels as well, and I still do write novels, but the more I wrote and the older I got, the more I realized I really enjoy writing flash fiction and short stories. So that's what I've been working on now. But the other thing is, I feel like with short fiction, there's room for interpretation. I really like open-ended endings. So that's what, like, I feel like if you write a novel, if you're writing a series or a standalone, it's like it should have like a definitive ending, almost, not in every case, but for the most part. And I feel like with flash fiction and short stories, there's a little bit of wiggle room that you can kind of leave it open-ended, so that whatever your readers think, they can say, oh, the characters will do this when, as soon as I close the book, the characters are fine, or as soon as I close the book, those characters are definitely dead, and they can just interpret it however they want.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is about trusting your reader to feel like this is complete and to fill in the blanks. And that's actually something that horror requires a lot of its audience. And in fact, horror tends to work better when you do make your audience fill in the gaps. That's why sometimes, I mean, sometimes it's to keep a rating, but a lot of times you'll see in horror movies they'll show the axe coming towards the person, and then they won't show the axe entering the person. They'll show the blood spatter hitting the apple over here. So your brain ends up filling the gaps in a way that showing you would not be as effective at doing sometimes. Like one of the horror movies that has affected me, and I would actually say it did traumatize me, and I don't use that lightly, was Human Centipede, which didn't actually show you a lot, but I filled in the gaps so effectively that it affected me for 6 whole months. And yeah, that's an issue for another day. But flash fiction really does end up using a very similar literary device in that it doesn't show you everything, but allows for the reader to fill in the gaps in a very effective way, often with the use of a few sentences and how you phrase those sentences. So yeah, I really enjoy how writing at different lengths forces me to look at writing in different ways. So I end up using long form techniques on short form and short form techniques on in long, just because I have a better idea at each level what these techniques are used for and how they can be used in different ways.
And of course, that just increases all the ideas, because we're writers and we definitely need more ideas, right?
Oh, goodness gracious.
That's a problem that we all have, that we all love to hate to have. If that made sense, I don't even know.
I have a list of ideas that I have not gotten to yet. Yeah.
Oh, me too. I have a whole spreadsheet. It's brutal. But, speaking of horror, since you tied that with the short stories and stuff, and we probably should have asked this earlier in the episode, but it's not the Mary Writer podcast if we don't get off topic and jump around a bit. I want to ask, since you write in a wide range of genres, what gravitated you like towards horror and fantasy? And do you have a favorite that you like to write?
I think that when I started to read and my parents started to read to me, they kind of they started with speculative fiction because that's a really fun for kids, being in fantasy worlds, stuff like Redwall and Wrinkle in Time. I did read other things like Secret Garden, Little Princess, Anne of Green Gables, but I really did get an introduction to speculative fiction early on, and I enjoy that in visual media. I enjoy it even in music. So I really like writing in fantasy and horror because it's such a vast world to exist in. You can write about ghosts, you can write about monsters, you can write about sorcerers, you can write about beasts. And the wonderful thing about these things is they are not in the world. They are often proxies for things that are in the world, or reality is the springboard for what's in these fantasy and horror worlds. But it's actually really, it's comforting. It's more comforting to process reality through the lens of speculative fiction than it is to live in reality, which is why we all stream and binge our stories, and we read all these books, and we throw ourselves into these fantasy and horror worlds because the darkness in these places can be not always defeated. Sometimes they can be defeated, but sometimes they can just simply be processed. And I mean, we already live in reality. If I wanted to be in reality, I'd be more in reality, but clearly I don't want to be in reality, and that's why that's why I spend all these times with all these fantasy and horror worlds, sexy or evil, because in real life, evil is just so boring and banal and awful and cruel in a very not interesting way, whereas in fantasy and horror, it's far more interesting.
That is a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think part of it is that usually with those books, sometimes there's not always a happily ever after, but a lot of times there are. And it's like you look at the real world and then you read those books and you're like, okay, I know things are going to get better. So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah, expectations, I think, are really comforting for a lot of readers. In romance, you can tolerate all the terrible things that's going on with your characters because it's going to end with a happily ever after or happily for now. So there's a kind of release of that tension. In horror, you don't always get that release. You don't always know that the evil is going to be defeated, although it often is. But as we know from a lot of these horror franchises, just because the evil is defeated for now does not mean it will continue to be defeated. And often in sequels, the people who survived the first one will die. So there's no guarantee in the realm of horror, but it's a little bit more comforting in other genres. But I think in horror, I think the comfort is that it's not real. I mean, that's one of the things that allows me to watch graphic horror and enjoy it, and write extreme horror and enjoy it, is knowing that's not an axe hitting somebody's chest. That is an axe hitting latex and spraying cornstarch, not real blood. Even though it looks really real, I know that it isn't. And that makes it a lot more enduring and endurable. Because in real life, I cannot abide cruelty. Even in cases where I am terrified of cockroaches, but I need to kill cockroaches. I recognize that cockroaches perform an ecological service and they are quite necessary, but they terrify me and I must annihilate them. And I apologize to them the entire time that I am hunting them down to smash them into smithereens. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's not personal. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So I cannot abide cruelty. And yet I watch and I read and I write about profound cruelty because it's not real. And it's like I don't know how else to put it. A lot of people who don't like horror or are very critical of horror, and they call it torture porn, and think that the people who enjoy it must enjoy it because they want to do it. But on the contrary, my experience with people who love horror like this, they are in fact quite empathic and very sympathetic and very, very kind people. So I think they process the cruelties of the world through fiction where it simply is not real. And we can tell the difference between what is real and what isn't, perhaps more than a lot of the people who think that books are going to do anything but make you more sympathetic, empathetic to the world that you're in.
I have to say, I always find, especially with horror movies, a lot of times the people that die, not all of them, but some of them, usually the first ones, are often put in annoyingly. It's almost, you get to the point where you're like, oh my God, just kill her already. Just, oh, it's like, there's so many where the earlier on, it's always some annoying character that you just don't like and you just can't connect with. And then the ones that survive, not all of them, sometimes you've got to hit those heartstrings where you're like, oh, I really like that character. They were going to get on. But, the one who usually survives is the one that you feel yourself rooting for. You either relate to them or you think, you know what, they bloody deserve it. Whereas, the first one to get hacked to bits, it's kind of like, well, you know what? They had it coming.
Yeah,
I didn't like
you get
it.
the cheers in the theater. Yeah.
Exactly.
See, to me, even though I know it's not real, I still can't watch that stuff because my anxiety kicks in and I start feeling like that it's happening to me in that very moment. And then I just I can't. And I think that's part of it too. I find it so interesting that there's so many people that get that thrill of being scared. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I don't understand the appeal of it, but I find it amazing that so many people, like my cousins, they go to haunted houses every Halloween and they'll go to a ton of different haunted houses. And I'm like, why? Why would you do that to yourself?
Well, what's really interesting is that they did a study on people who watch horror movies and they don't like horror movies and people who watch horror movies and they love horror movies. And what they found, and of course, this can't be thrown all across the board is that people who watch horror movies but don't like horror movies, their brain actually kind of tries to create a wall. And so their response to the stimuli is a bit muted. Whereas people who love horror movies, they're watching it. And it's not that they aren't scared, it's that they embrace it. So their minds actually start lighting up in all of those emotional places. So they are scared. They just embrace that feeling rather than trying to pull back from it. And I think it comes down to the reason why I love to watch really just violent horror is it's a lot easier to process violence when it isn't real and it isn't real. So it's safe to have those feelings, knowing that the book will close, the movie will reach the credits, and you'll walk out into a bright day from this dark place. And that's really comforting for me. Even when I feel the terror and I'm really invested and I scream at all the right places, it's just really nice to be able to get outside of it. Now, when I'm writing, it turns out that this kind of backfires on me, especially if I'm writing extreme horror in long form. I'm sitting there in my feelings for a month or two, cumulative, and it's incredibly unpleasant. But sometimes I just have things in my head that need to come out of it. So I sit with the unpleasant feelings, I examine the unpleasant feelings, and I kind of look it in the face. I look cruelty in the face. I find the cruelty in me, and I don't necessarily exercise it, but I don't know whether that's what some people would call doing shadow work, kind of seeing in yourself the capacity to be a terrible human being, even if you generally aren't, but kind of acknowledging, yeah, I'm part of the problem. I am part of the human problem, and realizing you may not always be good, you may not always be kind, you may not always be nice. And admitting to that, seeing that part of you, I think you can, instead of trying to pretend it doesn't exist, you can kind of hold that shadow and feed your inner child. I don't know.
Well, you're embracing your inner child,
Yeah.
and you're looking deeper within yourself.
A lot of cruelty and stuff like that, it comes from being scared. And people think it's about being sad, people think it's about being angry and hateful, but it all really comes back down to being scared of what's going to happen to you. So I think if you can look at that part of you that gets scared, you might be less inclined to be sad, to be angry, to be hateful.
Again, that's another interesting way of looking at it. Because what you said with the brain and the study and stuff, the brain is such an amazing thing. That's all I gotta say about that. It fascinates me.
I love the brain. The brain is awesome.
No, but that's it though, isn't it? It's like I watch horror, but I'm not like, oh my God, I love horror. And I have to have a filter. My partner always watches because he's a big horror fan. He will watch horror movies and then he'll say, like, yes, this is a really good story. It's got good atmosphere. You'll really like it. However, there is this, this, and this. And if he's good, which sometimes he forgets, he'll give me a clue when something's coming up that I know I can't cope with. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes it happens. I'll be like, oh my God. And it's like, oh yeah, sorry, that's just about to happen. So
I do that when I watch horror with my parents because they're not horror people. But it's like sometimes I want them to watch something not for the horror but for the story. So I prepare them with, okay, violence is coming, there will be blood. You don't have to look. It's fine.
well, that's it. I'm not a big fan of the kind of like where something's like crawling towards you. Like, is it The Ring?
Oh, the out of the TV, yeah, The Ring.
Yes, that one. Anything like that where suddenly it's like lunging at you. Not a big fan of scary faces lunging at me or anything like that. I love having those moments of feeling scared because I found this with other things when you see it online and people are like, oh, yeah, I don't like this, I don't like that. It's like, that's okay. But we're humans, we should feel emotion. It's like if you suffer a loss, feeling the grief is how you move through it. Avoiding the grief constantly doesn't help. You need to feel the grief. You need to feel excitement. You need to feel passion. You need to feel fear. You need to feel sorrow because they're part of humanity and it's important to have those. And surely as writers, having those feelings makes it a lot easier to write about them. So yeah, that's I have to say that's one of the reasons I do like watching some horrors.
Yeah, some of the, especially I think there's been a prevalence in the last like 5 to 10 years of grief horror, and I think it's been a chance for a lot of horror people and even not horror people to kind of process the pain of not just losing someone to death, but sometimes losing someone to Alzheimer's. So yeah, having that lack of recognition, the pain of losing yourself sometimes to aging, because you look in the mirror and it's not who you think it's not what you think you're going to see there. So a lot of horror is about emotional pain, and I think it's more like the blood and the gore, and even sometimes not having those things at all. That's just kind of the trappings. That's the stage it's put on, but so often it's about human emotion, like you said, and it's a chance for you to kind of stare into it unflinchingly.
Exactly. Perfectly said. This is not going to be a nice segue because it just doesn't work in with it, but I'm just going to jump to the next question anyway. With all that, how did you decide which publishing path you wanted to take with your writing?
So I think like everybody, I wanted to be the New York Times bestselling novelist, traditionally published with an agent and stuff like that. And that wasn't how I started out. I write under two names. Under this name, Amanda Blake, I write more mainstream stuff, although it includes, sex scenes and stuff like that. It's not quite as prevalent. Whereas I also write under the name Aurelia T. Evans, which is a spicier fare. It's very similar stuff, just a lot spicier. And I started self-publishing under Amanda Blake, but I started traditionally publishing under my spicier name. And that's more a function of a publisher decided to take a chance on me under my other name. I couldn't quite figure out how to get my long gothic young adult novel in front of people when most young adult stuff at the time was under 100,000 and mine was 120,000. It's gothic. It's going to be a little bit wordier. So I started out self-publishing under this name so that I could put out stuff that was a little bit outside of convention at the time. So I self-published the gothic young adult novel Nocturne and because it was too long for anything else, and I had cut it as far back as I could. And then I also self-published my Thorn series because I wanted full creative control. I didn't want to write to market. I didn't want to change things because the market said so. I wanted to write queer characters. I wanted to, and I didn't want a publishing company to suddenly pull out because it wasn't doing well. I mean, I think that's one of the things that keeps people from reading series a lot, is that so many series are not followed through on by traditional publishing. So I wanted to make sure that every book would be available and would be consistent and that sort of thing. So self-publishing gives me a lot of control. I do have editors. I do have a cover artist. I do have a formatter, although I'm experimenting with doing some formatting myself. Between Atticus and Vellum, it's actually amazing what you're able to do by yourself. But self-publishing does give me a chance to kind of do what I want if no one else wants it. Of course, the problem with that is that I'm terrible at marketing. So that leaves me a little bit high and dry. But recently I started doing more traditional publishing. And what's wonderful about that is that they take care of marketing. They have contacts. They already have an established audience. So if they post stuff, more people will see it. And the single payment markets for like the poetry and short stories are a lot more reliable than my royalties for. I can write a 120,000 page novel and make less on it than my short story. But the downside to that is, I don't have to pay for editing. I don't have to pay for cover. I don't have to pay for marketing. But on the other hand, I don't have as much control over those things. So I have to follow house rules. I have to like I can provide what I want the cover to look like, but I don't have as much veto power. So you are more likely to be successful and get, if you're not a marketing person, you're more likely to be successful doing traditional publishing because they'll take some of those reins, or at least give you a place to look to do it. But on the other hand, you might not have as much control, and you might end up having to change things for reasons that you don't necessarily always agree with. But if it's not like a sticking point, like the entire meaning changes if I change this, usually you'll just go for the path of least resistance, and sometimes it will end up better for it. But you may lose what you started out with, what you had hoped for to begin with. Or if you don't write to market, which I can't, I don't know how, you may not be picked up by traditional publishing. So it just kind of sits there. So I think I'm going to continue to do hybrid publishing, doing some of my own stuff, and then also submitting out to small presses and agents, and hopefully kind of find a nice little balance there. Right now, I'm broke, so I can't really do much in the way of self-publishing, and I have to depend on traditional publishing. But hopefully when and if that changes, I can have a little bit more fun with the things that can't really find a home, but I can put out there, which, man, can you imagine, like 20 years ago that wasn't really an option, and now you can make your own book, and that's mind-blowing.
It is. It's
Yeah.
amazing how things have changed over the years. And I really like how you seem to have such a good handle on your publication process. That's amazing.
And it looks good too. It's like the early self-publishing stuff looked like something you could make in a high school printing room, and now it's so professional. It makes you proud even when it doesn't find an audience. You just kind of hope that one day this one book will launch attention, and all your other little babies will get attention as well.
That's actually true, because like if one of your books can kind of get in front of an audience, a lot of people will then go, oh, what else have they written? And then they'll go sort of hunting for it. And but it's good that you have that kind of like, you've bridged between both. You've tried self-publishing, you've tried the traditional publishing. And honestly, I don't think we've had any writer on this podcast who've ever said, you know what, I love marketing. I am great at marketing. We would like to find that one person in the world who apparently is good at marketing, because we want to interview them.
I think Chuck Wendig is very good at it. Yeah, no, I think if we wanted to be marketers, we wouldn't be writers. It's like we spend all of our days just kind of hunched over our computers, working on words. What do you mean we need to be graphic designers and extroverts? What is this? What did you think? What do you think I was writing for?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, despite co-hosting a podcast, I don't want to talk to people. That's what you got to do when you market it.
Yeah. I want my writing perceived. I don't want to be perceived.
Yes, exactly. How many books do you have out total?
Oh, geez. Under this name, let's see, there's Nocturne, Drift, Deep Down, Question Not My Salt. There's 4 books in the Thorns series. So I think that makes 8, 9. So my fingers are bent. And then under my other name, I had an 11-book series, a trilogy, 2 trilogies, and I'm in the 4th book of another series that's being published. So that's 11, 17, 23. I have 23 books. I've been writing a long time.
All right, well, I'm slacking apparently. So with that, what are you currently working on?
Right now, I'm in the process of finishing up the 5th novel in the fairy tale mashup series, Thorn series, Crooked House, which is more horror inspired than some of the other ones. And that will probably be my last self-published work for a while, because the only thing left to pay for on that is the formatting, which will only be like $65 or so. In June, I finished a kind of alternate history gothic plague novel that was loosely inspired by Phantom of the Opera. It's kind of a gender bent phantom. And later this month, after I've finished with the editing and written a novelette, I'm going to finally do that Dracula reimagining that I've been wanting to do for a while. I tried to write it 3 years ago, and at 75,000 words, I realized it was not working. I was so mad. I was so mad. But I'm going to try again. I'm going to try again. I am obsessed with Dracula. If I were to be said to have a special interest, Dracula would be it. So it's kind of been a bucket list dream to finally write a Dracula reimagining. So hopefully I can get that done this month, or probably next month. And then after that, I sit down and I edit everything that I've been working on so far. So
Wow, so like a big edit session for, oh my God, that sounds painful.
yeah, just sit down and I love editing. So, and it's a lot of cutting. I overwrite and then I cut everything down. I don't like adding, because it's like my brain doesn't want to write when I'm editing. So if I have to, it's like, nope, 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 nope. Whereas cutting is a lot easier. I have no problem killing my darlings.
I wish I had that. I write a lot, but then I don't like cutting anything. It's like, it's all important. Everything needs to stay in. And then I get red marks on it going, this is boring. You don't need that. And no, not a fan of editing or marketing or writing. No, I am okay with that. Oh yeah, I definitely want to read Dracula reimagining. I love Dracula. Love the movies. Actually, my favorite is Dracula Dead and Loving It with Leslie Nielsen, which is the comedy one. But still.
I've only seen clips of that, but yeah.
So one of my funniest films. I love it. I can just, if I'm ever in one of those funks and you just need to sort of cheer yourself up, that is my go-to. That and Murder by Death.
I love Young Frankenstein. That makes me crack up.
Frankenstein, yes. Frankenstein. Yep. Rach, have you got any other points before I head to the last question we hid from you?
I am all set.
And don't worry, it's just a silly thing we're going to do. So yes, Amanda, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. We do have one final quick question. Are you a tea drinker or a coffee drinker? Which is your favorite?
It depends on the time of year. I would say I'm probably more a tea drinker than a coffee drinker, in the sense that when I drink coffee, it is filled with so much milk and sugar, I'm not sure it still qualifies. Whereas tea, I will just drink tea with spices and stuff like that. It's like you can still taste the tea quality, whereas I'm pretty sure that when I drink coffee, it's actually chocolate milk.
I am claiming that, Rach.
What I'm hearing is you can never be invited back on this podcast.
Just saying, I like chai tea latte put me right in the center, right between them.
Oh, I'm still claiming it because technically you said tea first, so my win. My win.
Yes, yeah, no, that's fair. We'll give you a tea. We're gonna try to keep tally of all of our guests of who's a coffee drinker and who's a tea drinker and see if who sides with me and who sides with Ari.
But I mostly like tea during the winter, and I am in Texas. We don't have much of that.
No backtracking. No backtrack. No backtracking. No.
But
No.
like I said, I drink a lot of coffee, but I'm not sure whether it's still coffee by the time I'm drinking it.
Coffee flavored milk does not count. No. No.
It's fine. It counts. It could count.
I am on a chai latte kick. I'm drinking a lot of
Fine,
that.
I'll put you down for a tea.
Okay, before we go, please let our listeners know where they can find you and check out your work. Just, do a bit of pimping.
Love doing that. Okay. You can pretty much find everything that I write at amandamblake.com. I have headers for short stories, poetry, standalone novels, my Thorns series, and under my About the Author, you can find a link to my other name as well if you want to check that out. I'm in the middle of an dark urban fantasy standalone series there. I finished a demonic circus, be careful what you wish for type series. So those are all available under my other name, and under this one earlier this year, Question Not My Salt, an extreme Thanksgiving family dinner novel, came out through Crystal Lake. And I think that's, aside from the 5th book in the Thorn series, that's pretty much all that's coming out this year. I had other plans, but I also planned to be employed, and that didn't happen. So
I'm just going to throw in the recording of this is 2024. So there might be more books popping up when this goes out in 2025.
Oh, there might be.
Yeah, so yeah, that's it. You can have the way you're writing, you can have a whole new series out. So intense.
I'm always sending out new pieces, so who knows what's going to happen next year.
Exactly. Amanda, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And to our listeners, all of Amanda's links will be in the description below. So obviously go and check out their work, all the books and everything. We'll try and put as much as we can on. Before we leave, if you want to learn more about us, the podcast, and opportunities to be a guest on the show, don't forget to check out our Podbean website. Now we'll turn it over to you guys. Give Amanda a shout out in the comments and let them know your thoughts about their work. Remember, we release new episodes every Wednesday. Next week, we're discussing book titles. To ensure you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button on the way out. And as always, thanks for listening to the Merry Writer Podcast. See you next week. This podcast is brought to you by Excessive Caffeine. We drink a lot. The music titled Inspired is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.